What's the creepiest or most bizarre experience you had during your childhood? When I was about 11, my family moved to a small town in Australia. Our new house was near the outskirts, close to a stretch of bushland that everyone called the Black Hollow. Locals said it was haunted, but my parents waved it off as superstitions. One afternoon, bored and curious, I decided to ride my bike down the dirt path that led into the hollow. The farther I went, the quieter it got. No birds, no insects, just an eerie silence. The trees grew denser, twisting into strange shapes, and the light barely filtered through the canopy. Eventually, I came across an old, rusted swing set standing alone among the trees. One of the swings was moving, gently swaying back and forth, though there was no breeze. I felt a sudden chill and turned to leave, but then I heard a voice, a child's giggle, faint and distant. I told myself it was just the wind, but then the giggling got louder, closer, almost right behind me. I bolted for my bike and pedaled harder than I ever had in my life. Even after I was out of the hollow, I didn't stop until I was back home, gasping for breath. That night, I had nightmares about the swing and the laughter. My parents insisted it was just my imagination, but a neighbor later told me that decades ago, 2 kids had disappeared in the hollow and were never found. Their mother had donated a swing set in their memory, and it was still out there, slowly rusting away. To this day, I refuse to go near forests or woods alone. Sometimes, when I see a swing set and it's moving without a breeze, I can almost hear that distant, ghostly giggle again. When I was about 10, my family took a trip to Scotland. We stayed in a small bed and breakfast that was actually part of a restored 17th century castle. It was beautiful. Towering stone walls, narrow spiral staircases, and rooms filled with antique furniture. It also had that damp, cold air that never really goes away, no matter how many fires you light. On our second night there, I couldn't sleep. The wind was howling outside, and the old windows rattled constantly. At some point in the middle of the night, I decided to go to the bathroom, which was located at the end of a long, narrow hallway lined with portraits. As I was walking down the hallway, I had the overwhelming feeling that someone was behind me. I turned around, but no one was there. I tried to brush it off and kept going. That's when I noticed that one of the portraits, an oil painting of a stern-looking man in old-fashioned clothes, seemed different. His eyes, dark and cold, looked like they were following me. I hurried past and made it to the bathroom. On my way back, I couldn't resist looking again. This time, I swear the man's mouth was curved ever so slightly into a smirk. I froze, heart pounding, before sprinting back to my room. The next morning, I told my dad, expecting him to laugh. Instead, he got oddly serious and said, "You know, some people believe portraits can trap a piece of the soul." He said it offhandedly, like a joke, but it didn't feel like one. For the rest of the trip, I avoided that hallway. Years later, I read about the castle's history and learned that the man in the portrait had been rumored to practice dark arts and mysteriously vanished without a trace. Some locals believed he cursed the castle before he disappeared. I don't know if that's true, but ever since then, I've never liked being alone in old buildings filled with paintings. You never really know who's watching. When I was 11, my family went on a beach vacation to a small island off the coast of South Carolina. It was quiet, not very touristy. Just a handful of rental houses and endless stretches of dunes and marshland. One evening, just before sunset, I went for a walk along the beach by myself. The tide was low, and strange things had washed ashore. Driftwood, jellyfish, and something that looked like an old, barnacle-encrusted box. Curious, I pried it open. Inside was a collection of odd items. Old coins, a broken compass, and what looked like a lock of hair tied with a red ribbon. As I inspected the contents, I felt a sudden, sharp drop in temperature. Then I noticed something out in the water, a figure standing waist-deep in the surf, staring directly at me. I thought it was just a swimmer, but as the sun dipped lower, the figure didn't move. It just stood there, motionless. I called out, but there was no response. I felt a wave of unease and backed away. But when I looked again, the figure was closer, though I hadn't seen it move. Terrified, I ran back to the house, clutching the box. That night, the wind howled louder than usual, and I swore I could hear whispers on the breeze. The next morning, the box was gone. Disappeared from the spot where I had hidden it under the porch. I don't know what I found that evening, but I've never been back to that island. Sometimes I still dream about the figure in the surf, silent, still, and waiting. When I was a kid growing up in Tokyo, my school was located next to an old, crumbling apartment building that had been abandoned for years. Rumors circulated among the students about why it was empty. Some said it was haunted, others whispered about something worse. One afternoon, on a dare, my friends and I decided to sneak inside after school. The front entrance was chained, but we found a broken window around the back. Inside, it was exactly what you'd expect: dust, graffiti, broken glass. We explored the first few floors without incident, but as we reached the fourth floor, we heard a loud banging noise from above. Figuring it was just the building settling, we pushed on. Then we found an apartment with the door slightly open. Inside, the place was wrecked: overturned furniture, shattered mirrors. But the creepiest thing was a wall completely covered in newspaper clippings. They were all about missing children from decades past, dozens of them. Suddenly, we heard footsteps in the hallway, heavy, deliberate steps, not like a fellow kid sneaking around. We froze, barely breathing. The footsteps got closer, closer, until they stopped right outside the door. Without thinking, we bolted, scrambling down the stairs and not stopping until we were out and back on school grounds. None of us ever spoke about it again. The building was demolished a few years later, but every time I walk past where it once stood, I get a chill and a strange urge to run. When I was 9, I went to a summer camp in northern Canada. It was a rustic place, wooden cabins, campfires every night, swimming in the lake. Everything was perfect, until one evening during a game of Capture the Flag. The game took us deep into the woods. It was my job to guard our flag, which meant hiding alone in the trees. As the sun set, the forest became a wall of black shadows and weird sounds. I told myself I wasn't scared, until I noticed something moving between the trees. At first, I thought it was another camper sneaking around, but it didn't move like a person. It was too tall, too thin, and it didn't make any noise. It would stand still for long periods, then suddenly shift locations without me seeing it move. I crouched low, holding my breath, praying it wouldn't notice me. But it did. Slowly, it started moving toward me, gliding almost, not walking. I finally panicked and sprinted back to camp, yelling for help. The counselors told me it was just a trick of the light, that being alone in the woods plays with your mind. But a few days later, another kid swore he saw the same thing during a night hike. After that, the camp banned games in the deep woods. I still go camping sometimes, but I always make sure there's a big, roaring fire, and I never wander too far from it. When I was about 8, my family took a summer trip to visit my grandparents in rural Italy. They lived in a small village tucked between the hills, the kind of place with narrow cobblestone streets and houses older than America itself. One afternoon, I wandered away from the main square and found myself at an abandoned church. The windows were shattered, and the doors hung loosely on their hinges. Despite the way it looked, I felt drawn to it. I stepped inside and was instantly struck by the heavy, musty air. The pews were broken and covered in dust, and the altar was barely standing. But what caught my attention was a door behind the altar, slightly ajar. Curious, I pushed it open and found a narrow stone staircase spiraling down. Against my better judgment, I went down, using the light from my cheap plastic flashlight to guide me. The basement was cold and damp, with walls lined with old statues and faded religious paintings. And in the center of the room was a stone slab, like an altar, with what looked like fresh flowers placed on top. As I approached, I heard a whisper, not words, just a breath, close to my ear. I spun around, but no one was there. Suddenly, the flashlight flickered and went out, plunging me into darkness. I bolted up the stairs, tripping and scraping my knees, not daring to look back. Later, my grandfather scolded me for wandering off. When I told him what I saw, his face went pale. He said that church had been abandoned for decades, ever since a young priest had mysteriously vanished, never to be found. They sealed it up after that. Even today, whenever I visit my grandparents, I avoid that part of the village. I don't want to know if the whispers are still there. When I was 10, my best friend lived just a few houses down the street. One evening, we decided to explore the woods behind our neighborhood, a dense patch of trees we weren't really supposed to go into. We were about 20 minutes in when we found an old, crumbling shed. The door hung off its hinges and it smelled of damp wood and something else, something metallic and rotten. Inside there wasn't much, just broken tools, old cans, and a dirt floor. But in the far corner, there was a trap door. Of course, being stupid kids, we decided to open it. It creaked loudly as we pried it up, revealing a narrow staircase leading down into darkness. We didn't have a flashlight, but we had matches. My friend struck one and held it out in front of us. The flickering light barely reached the bottom, but what we saw made us both gasp. Chains bolted to the walls, old, stained mattresses on the ground, and what looked like bones. The match burned out, and in the momentary darkness, we heard a dragging sound coming from below. We didn't wait to find out what it was. We sprinted all the way home without looking back. We never told our parents. We were too afraid they wouldn't believe us, or worse, that they would. Even now, I can't drive past those woods without feeling a knot in my stomach. Sometimes I wonder if anyone ever found that shed, or if whatever was down there is still waiting. When I was 6, my parents bought a beautiful old Victorian house in a small town. The place had all the charm of a classic home: high ceilings, creaky wooden floors, stained glass windows. But from the moment we moved in, I hated my bedroom. At night, I would hear faint tapping sounds on the walls, as if someone was scratching just behind the wallpaper. Sometimes I would wake up feeling like someone was standing at the foot of my bed, just watching me. My parents said it was just my imagination. One evening, while playing hide-and-seek with my older brother, I decided to hide in the attic, a place I was usually too scared to go. It was dark and filled with old, dusty furniture. As I crouched behind a trunk, I heard whispering. Not my brother's voice, something softer, almost melodic. It was coming from the far corner of the attic. I strained my eyes, and in the dim light, I saw a small rocking chair gently moving back and forth. There was no breeze, no draft, but the chair rocked steadily, creaking softly. Then I saw what looked like the faint outline of a little girl sitting in the chair, humming to herself. I screamed and bolted downstairs. My parents, frustrated, brushed it off, saying it was just a trick of the light, but I refused to ever go back into that attic. Years later, when we moved out, the new owners did some renovations and found a small hidden room behind the attic walls. Inside were old toys, children's clothes, and a dusty music box that still played a soft, haunting tune. No one could explain how it got there or who it belonged to. When I was about 9, my family took a road trip across the southwestern states. We were somewhere in New Mexico, driving through endless desert, when our car broke down. No cell service, no towns nearby, just an old gas station about a mile back. So my dad and I decided to walk there while my mom stayed with the car. The gas station was straight out of a horror movie. Peeling paint, rusty pumps, the kind of place that looked abandoned even though it wasn't. A bell rang as we pushed the door open. Inside it was dim and smelled like motor oil and mildew. A man sat behind the counter reading a newspaper. He barely looked up when we walked in. While my dad talked to him about calling a tow truck, I wandered toward the back, where there were dusty shelves and a cooler humming loudly. That's when I noticed the photos. Dozens of them, pinned to a board behind the counter. Photos of families, all standing by their cars, all smiling. At first, it seemed normal. Maybe just customers over the years. But the longer I looked, the more off it felt. None of the people looked happy. Their smiles were stiff, forced, and there were no recent pictures. Everything looked decades old. Then I noticed something even creepier. A photo of a family standing next to a car that looked exactly like ours. Same model, same color. And the family. They looked eerily like us, only wearing old-fashioned clothes. I tugged on my dad's sleeve and pointed it out. He frowned, muttered something to the attendant, and we left immediately, deciding we'd rather risk waiting in the heat than stay there a minute longer. A few hours later, a kind stranger in a pickup truck stopped and helped us out. We never talked about that gas station again, but even now, sometimes when I drive through the desert and see a rundown station on the side of the road, I wonder if it's still there. And if it is, what happens to the families that stay too long? When I was 7, my family moved into a very old farmhouse deep in the countryside. It was the kind of place that looked charming during the day. Big oak trees, creaky wood floors, a sprawling field out back, but turned downright eerie once the sun went down. We had only been living there for a few weeks when strange things started happening. At first it was small stuff, creaking footsteps upstairs when everyone was downstairs, doors that would slowly swing open even when all the windows were shut. My parents brushed it off. Old house, old noises, nothing to worry about. But one night, everything changed. I woke up around 2 in the morning to a faint tapping sound on my bedroom window. Now, my room was on the second floor, and there was no way for anyone to reach that window without a ladder. I stayed frozen under the covers, heart racing, telling myself it was just a tree branch. But when I finally worked up the courage to peek through the blinds, I saw a figure standing there, just a dark silhouette against the moonlight. It wasn't moving, just standing completely still. I couldn't make out any features, just the outline of a head and shoulders. I blinked hard, rubbed my eyes, but the figure was still there. I tried to scream, but my voice caught in my throat. After what felt like an eternity, the figure slowly backed away from the window and disappeared into the darkness. The next morning, I told my parents. My dad went outside to check and found nothing. No footprints in the soft dirt, no broken branches, nothing disturbed. They told me it was a nightmare, but I knew what I saw. For weeks after that, I slept with the light on and the covers pulled up to my nose. Years later, when I was a teenager, my mom finally admitted to me that we weren't the first family to have strange experiences in that house. Before us, a man had lived there alone. A reclusive man who, according to the neighbors, had disappeared without a trace one night and was never found. Even now, whenever I visit old farmhouses or hear the creak of old wood at night, a chill runs down my spine. I'll never forget that shadow at my window, and the feeling that even though I couldn't see his face, he was definitely watching me.